By the time she reached the clearing, her breath came out in thin, broken clouds that vanished as quickly as hope. The snow had crusted hard over older drifts, crunching under boots whose soles were worn thin. She had wrapped burlap around her ankles and tied it with twine, a poor man's answer to winter, but the cold found its way in anyway. It always did. The cabin ahead glowed like a held breath, one square of yellow light set against a wilderness that seemed determined to swallow everything that dared to stop moving. She paused at the edge of the trees, fingers numb, heart hammering. She had practiced what to say all afternoon while the sun slipped away. Words she hated, words that made her feel smaller than the snowflakes melting in her hair. But hunger had stripped her down to truth, and cold had taught her speed. If she waited too long, she'd lose the nerve, or worse, the feeling in her feet. She forced herself forward. The door opened after her second knock. He filled the frame, broad shoulders, beard dusted with frost, eyes the color of river stones in winter. A lone cowboy, she guessed, the kind who lived far from towns and farther from trouble. The wind shoved her forward, and she blurted the sentence she'd rehearsed, the one that tasted like ash. It came out rough and rushed, as if she could outrun it. The words hung between them, ugly and exposed. He didn't flinch. He didn't grin. He didn't reach for her. He studied her instead, the way a man studies the sky before deciding whether to ride out or stay put. He noticed the burlap, the way she kept her hands clenched tight inside her sleeves, the tremor she couldn't hide. His gaze wasn't greedy, it was measuring, steady, and somehow that made her chest ache more. She waited for judgment, for a price, for a door slammed in her face. None came. What's your name? He asked. The question knocked the breath from her. Names were for people with a place to stand. Names were for tomorrow. She almost told him she didn't have one. Instead, she whispered it, the sound swallowed by the wind. Saying it felt like stepping onto thin ice, dangerous, necessary. He nodded once, as if he'd been handed something valuable and meant to keep it safe. The cold pushed again, sharper now. Her knees buckled, and she caught herself on the doorframe. He reached out, not to pull her close, not to hurry her inside, but to steady the door against the wind. That restraint did something to her she didn't have words for. She had braced for cruelty or for kindness that demanded payment. What she found instead was space. Space to stand, space to breathe. She tried to explain, stumbling over her own story. The long road, the job that vanished, the sickness that ate what little she'd saved, the nights she slept in barns when she could find them and under trees when she couldn't. Each sentence felt like a confession. She spoke quickly, afraid he'd interrupt, afraid he'd decide she was too much trouble. He listened without comment, eyes never leaving her face, as if the details mattered because she did. A gust rattled the shutters. Snow spun past the threshold like sparks. The light behind him flickered, warm and steady, and she realized how badly she wanted that warmth. Not just on her skin, but in her bones, in the place where hope used to live. Her voice faltered. Shame rose hot and sudden, and she stared at the ground, waiting for him to say the thing she'd heard too many times already. Instead, he stepped aside. He didn't say come in. He didn't say stay. He simply made room. The open door poured heat into the night, and the wind lost its teeth at the line of light. She stood there for a long moment, suspended between what she had been willing to trade and what she might yet keep. Then she crossed the threshold, carrying nothing with her but a name and the stubborn belief that one night of warmth didn't have to cost her everything. The heat hit her all at once, a soft blow that made her knees go weak. She hadn't realized how cold she truly was until warmth wrapped around her like a living thing. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and coffee grounds, of clean wool and pine sap. It smelled like someone lived here on purpose. She hovered just inside the door, afraid to move too far in, afraid the welcome might vanish if she assumed too much. The cowboy closed the door gently, bracing it against the wind, then turned the latch. The sound was solid and final, not trapping, but sheltering. He shrugged out of his coat and draped it over a chair, leaving himself in a thick flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man used to being alone, used to doing things his own way. Still, he kept a respectful distance, as if an invisible line had been drawn between them that he had no intention of crossing. Sit, he said, nodding toward a chair near the fire. She hesitated, then obeyed. The chair creaked beneath her, and she folded in on herself, hands tucked under her arms. He returned from a shelf with a blanket, heavy, worn soft with years of use, and placed it around her shoulders. His fingers brushed her sleeve for half a second, nothing more. She flinched anyway, then hated herself for it. He noticed, stepped back, and said nothing. He ladled stew from a pot that had been kept warm near the hearth and set the bowl in her hands. The steam rose, rich and fragrant, and her stomach clenched so hard it hurt. She stared at it, suddenly afraid. Hunger had rules of its own. He waited, leaning against the table, eyes on the floor, giving her privacy she hadn't asked for but desperately needed. Eat, he said again, gently this time. She lifted the spoon with shaking fingers. The first mouthful burned her tongue, and she didn't care. Tears blurred her vision, falling into the bowl, but she kept eating. Each swallow felt like a small miracle. She tried to thank him, the words tangling with sobs, but he raised a hand, stopping her without looking up. You don't owe me, he said. Not a thing. The sentence landed heavy and strange. She had learned the opposite early on, that kindness always had a price, that survival meant bargaining with whatever you had left. She opened her mouth to protest, to explain again, to make the offer she believed he expected. He shook his head, firm but not unkind. No bargains, he said. Not tonight, maybe not ever. The fire popped, a log shifting. Outside, the wind held and failed to get inside. The cabin held its ground. She ate until the bowl was empty and then sat there, stunned by the simple fact of being full. He poured her a mug of something hot, tea, she guessed, and set it within reach. He kept busy after that, washing the bowl, setting things in order, giving her space to settle into the reality of being safe for a moment. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded smaller than she remembered. She told him about the road, about the places she'd slept curled around herself to keep warm. She told him about the things she'd said tonight because she didn't know what else to say. He listened without interrupting, jaw set, hands steady as he wiped the counter. When she finished, he nodded once, as if filing away facts he intended to remember. "There's a cot," he said, gesturing toward the corner near the window. "You can rest there, I'll take the chair." "That's not," she started, guilt rising. "It is," he said simply. She wrapped the blanket tighter and moved to the cot, each step careful, reverent. Lying down felt like surrender, and she braced herself for the familiar spike of fear that came with closing her eyes in a strange place. It didn't come. The fire crackled. The wind stayed outside. He sat at the table, back turned, giving her the dignity of trust. Sleep took her in pieces, short, shallow at first, then deeper, steadier. Somewhere in the night, she woke and found another blanket had been added, tucked around her feet. The chair creaked softly as he shifted, careful not to wake her. She closed her eyes again, the knot in her chest loosening at last. For the first time in a long while, warmth didn't demand anything from her. It simply stayed. Morning came quietly, the way it does when snow has softened the world. Pale light slipped through the frosted window, turning the cabin walls a gentle gray. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then warmth pressed against her back, the weight of blankets grounding her in a reality that felt unreal in its kindness. She lay still, listening, to the low murmur of wind outside, to the faint clink of metal, to the sound of someone moving without hurry. She sat up slowly. Her body ached in places she'd forgotten could ache when rest was allowed to do its work. The shame she'd carried into the night tried to rise with her, but it faltered, unsure of its footing here. The cowboy stood at the table, back to her, pouring coffee into two mismatched cups. He moved like a man who'd lived with quiet for so long it had become a companion rather than a burden. "You're awake," he said, without turning. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an order. Just a fact, acknowledged. She swung her legs over the side of the cot, feet meeting the cold floor. The chill was sharp but honest, nothing like the cruel cold outside. He slid a plate toward her, bread toasted dark, a smear of something that smelled faintly sweet. She took the cup he offered, nodding her thanks. The first sip of coffee was bitter and perfect. It felt like being welcomed into the day. "I'll leave at dawn," she said, the words automatic, learned. They had always been her way of easing herself out before she could be asked to go. She kept her eyes on the cup, waiting for the familiar nod, the relieved agreement. He didn't answer right away. He took his own cup and leaned against the counter, considering her as if she were a trail he meant to walk carefully. "There's work here," he said at last. "Not charity. Real work." Her heart thumped hard enough to hurt. Work meant staying. Staying meant being seen. "I can't pay rent," she said, already bracing. "You pay with your hands," he replied. "Chores. Cooking, if you want. Or mending. There's a fence that needs setting right. I won't pretend it's easy. But it's fair." Fair. The word lodged in her chest, heavy and bright. She nodded, afraid to speak. He set a small pouch on the table and pushed it toward her. "For now," he said. "For supplies. Town's a long ride." She looked at the pouch, then back at him. "I didn't." "I know," he said. "That's why." They ate in companionable silence. When she finished, she stood, folding the blanket with care, as if tidiness might prove she belonged. He stopped her with a shake of his head. "Later," he said. "There's no rush." Outside, the world was transformed. Snow lay clean and unbroken, the trees etched in white. She stepped onto the porch and breathed in air that didn't bite quite so hard. The cowboy followed, pointing out the shed, the well, the path that led toward the river. He explained the land as if introducing old friends. He didn't promise anything beyond today. Somehow, that made everything feel possible. By midday, her hands were red and sore from work, but it was a good ache, the kind that comes from effort, not fear. She mended a tear in a coat by the fire while he split wood, each of them finding a rhythm that didn't crowd the other. When she laughed at something small, a memory of a song she half remembered, he paused, surprised, then smiled like a man rediscovering a sound he thought he'd lost. As the light began to fade, she stood at the doorway again, the same place where she'd offered herself for warmth. The memory tugged at her, sharp and humiliating. He joined her, not touching, just standing beside her. "I won't forget what I said," she murmured. He shook his head. "You don't have to carry that here." She turned to face him fully, meeting his eyes without flinching. "Then let me earn my place," she said. "Let me choose to stay." He nodded. "Once. That's all I ever asked." The cabin glowed behind them, steady and sure. The cold gathered at the edges of the clearing, held at bay by lamplight and intention. She stepped back inside. Not because she had to, not because she owed anything, but because she wanted to. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, staying felt like the bravest choice she'd ever made.